Medford is a small town near Boston, Massachusetts. Though small, it packs a punch. This town has captured the nation's attention more than once. Amelia Earhart, the first female pilot to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, was born here. One of the largest bank heists in history also took place in Medford, when 5 men, including 3 former police officers, broke into a neighboring office and drilled a hole through a thick concrete wall. They then bored through 50 centimeters of concrete to reach the bank's vault. The robbers opened over 700 safety deposit boxes and stole $100 million in cash, gold, silver, and other valuables. Medford was also home to a regular family-owned restaurant, Bickford's, serving traditional American breakfasts, lunches, and dinners, a place where co-workers became enemies, where friendly smiles and sympathy turned into harassment, vandalism, assault, and ultimately led to one of the most notorious cases in Massachusetts history. Sandra, or Sandy Burfield, was in her early 20s when she moved to Everett, Massachusetts in 1988 to be closer to her sister, Sheila. She got a job as a waitress at Bickford's restaurant in Medford. Sandy was quickly hired because she was a very beautiful young woman with almond-shaped eyes and a thick mane of hair. She also had a knack for making friends easily. In the restaurant business, being outgoing and friendly is incredibly important, and the manager was very pleased with her. Apart from the occasional tardiness, there were no complaints about her work. She was sociable, great at connecting with people, and an incredibly kind person. Sometimes a homeless man would come into the restaurant and Sandy would feed him steak and breakfast from her own tips. She knew all too well that not everyone had it easy in life. At 16, she gave birth to a little girl named Diane, who was born with spina bifida. Sandy desperately wanted to spend all her free time with her daughter, but she needed to work, and Diane required constant care. Sandy had to place her daughter in a specialized clinic, but visited her whenever she could. Among Sandy's colleagues was Stephen Caruso. Stephen was studying photography, had a passion for computers, and had been a regular at the restaurant for 6 years, sometimes visiting a couple of times a day. He enjoyed the good food and casual chats with the staff. In 1993, the restaurant manager hired Steve as a handyman. He was highly skilled with his hands and excelled in various repair tasks, electrical work, plumbing, carpentry. Steve could do it all, but as talented as he was with his hands, he was equally strange in his interactions with others. Meanwhile, to save up for a car and visit her daughter more often, Sandy took a second job at a bar. She worked twice as much, but enjoyed both jobs, and now she had 2 sources of income. The bar became her second home. Sandy often spent time there even when she wasn't working. Tony Markin, a longtime friend, also liked to visit the bar. For many years, Sandy and Tony had been close friends, and after 8 years of knowing each other, they finally started dating. It happened naturally, as if they had always been meant to be together. Sandy's co-workers from the restaurant also liked to stop by the bar after work to have a drink. It was a great time for everyone, except for one dark cloud, Steve's behavior. He always came alone and acted inappropriately with the women, staring at them with a creepy, unsettling gaze. At the restaurant, Steve had his favorite waitresses. People joked that he changed them like gloves. He would specifically come in during their shifts and sit only at tables they were serving. The waitresses knew he was a bit odd but tolerated it. In 1996, it was Sandy's turn to become his favorite. Up until August 1998, their interactions were unremarkable. Sandy considered their relationship casual, almost friendly. In August 1997, Sandy's daughter Diane passed away, a devastating tragedy for her mother. After the loss, Sandy tried to be even kinder to everyone and didn't look down on people who behaved strangely. She became more patient, forgiving, and motherly, showing unconditional love to all. She also extended this friendly compassion to Steve. It's possible that Steve misinterpreted Sandy's vulnerability after her daughter's death and her friendliness toward him. He hovered around her, no matter what she was doing. While having a regular customer in the restaurant is generally a good thing, Steve became a distraction for Sandy when she was trying to take other customers' orders. In short, he paid too much attention to Sandy and was overly intrusive, which turned into a problem. At the end of August 1998, Steve began taking more assertive actions, inviting Sandy to see a movie at the theater. She politely declined the offer, but Steve didn't stop trying to impress her. He even went as far as washing Sandy's car without her permission. He continued to sit in his usual spot, watching Sandy without taking his eyes off her, smirking the entire time. Even Sandy's patience eventually ran out, and she started trying to minimize her interactions with him. After her repeated requests, the restaurant manager asked Steve to sit at a table in a different section of the restaurant. On August 24, 1998, Sandy was spending time at the home of one of her older sisters. Somehow, Stephen found out she would be there and showed up uninvited. Without opening the door, Sandy told Steve to leave. She was home alone and became very frightened. Around that time, Sandy started keeping a journal, documenting all the strange incidents involving Steve. It seemed she had a bad feeling about the situation and wanted to leave a record of his persistent and unsettling behavior. Sandy decided not to let things slide and took the initiative. Among the restaurant's regulars was a police officer, and Sandy asked him to have a word with Stephen. In the middle of the day, in front of all the customers, the officer approached Stephen and demanded that he stop bothering Sandy. Stephen felt humiliated. He rushed to the restaurant manager and threatened to file a lawsuit for discrimination. He also demanded a meeting with Sandy outside of the restaurant. Stephen even called the headquarters of the company that owned the restaurant, claiming that his conversation with the police officer had been insulting and demanded that Sandy be fired. He went on to say that Sandy was mentally unstable and offered to pay for her psychiatric treatment. However, the headquarters repeated that he was not allowed to sit at her table and Sandy would no longer serve him. At that point, it seemed like Stephen should have let the situation go and started eating at a different restaurant. Even in a small town, there were plenty of other options. But no, he continued to frequent the same restaurant, sitting in the same dining area, though not at Sandy's table. The way the restaurant was set up, though, allowed him to see her no matter where he sat, even though there were 3 separate dining areas. So even sitting in a different section, Stephen's eyes still followed Sandy, and his face burned with anger. Thus began an open hostility between the 2 colleagues. Sandy asked the restaurant to ban him from the premises. However, Stephen threatened to sue if they did, and the lawyers confirmed that he had the right to stay. Refusing him service would be illegal. This tense situation could have dragged on even longer, but at the end of September, Stephen truly crossed the line for the first time. He turned to vandalism. On the night of September 27, 1998, someone slashed all the tires on Sandy's car. There were no witnesses to the incident, and although Sandy suspected Steve, she had no proof. Theoretically, it could also have been her boyfriend, with whom she had temporarily broken up. But on the night of September 30th, 1998, just before dawn, while Sandy was lying on the couch at home, she heard someone trying to puncture her tires again. She looked out the window of her second-floor apartment. She noticed someone walking away from her car. He was dressed all in black and wearing a hood, so she couldn't see his face. But she recognized Steve by his distinctive walk. The man seemed to slightly hop when walking, while swinging his left arm forward and backward. She reported the incident to the police and said she suspected Steve. Fearing further acts of vandalism, Sandy installed a surveillance camera that constantly filmed the street below. On October 4th, 1998, when she was about to leave for work, her car started acting up. The repairman discovered that someone had poured battery acid, electrolyte, into the fuel tank. When she returned home, Sandy watched the footage from the camera. The video clearly showed the vandal approaching her car at 3:15 a.m. Once again, Sandy recognized Steve by his distinctive walk, though. Like last time, he was dressed in black and wearing a hood. On October 25th, 1998, around 2:15 a.m., someone once again poured the same liquid into Sandy's car's fuel tank. She was at home watching the act of vandalism on the monitor connected to the camera. First, a red car passed by her house. It was only partially visible, but Sandy knew Steve drove a similar car. 4 minutes later, from the direction where the red car had gone, a man in black clothing and a hood approached. His face was not visible. He was carrying something in his hand. The vandal approached Sandy's car, did something to the fuel tank, and returned in the same direction he had come from. At that moment, Sandy was calling 911. During the call, she ran downstairs to the first floor, from where she could observe the scene from a window in the hallway. As the man was leaving, he slightly turned his head for just a moment, but it was enough. She unmistakably identified Steve as the vandal. However, unfortunately at that time, acts like this did not result in an arrest. Sandy realized that she needed the help of law enforcement and sought a restraining order to prevent Stephen from coming near her or her car. However, at that time, the law did not allow for action against a stalker unless the victim was in a relationship with them. If Sandy and Steve had been dating and then he started damaging her car, that would have been a different case. But since there had been no relationship between Sandy and Steve, except for possibly work-related interactions, Steve also worked part-time at the restaurant as a handyman, he could only face administrative consequences. That was the extent of what the law could offer her at the time. Sandy persisted and managed to get the restraining order. It prohibited Stephen from coming within 90 meters. The order also barred him from visiting her workplace, resulting in him losing his job at the restaurant. Sandy believed the law would protect her, but instead it only infuriated Stephen even more. He somehow convinced himself that Sandy was mocking him, which drove him into a rage. Stephen paid no attention to the legal restrictions, even when the court tightened the conditions of the restraining order, extending the distance he had to maintain from her apartment to 450 meters. Thanks to video footage, he was charged with 3 counts of criminal property damage, though the police couldn't prove that Stephen had slashed her tires the first time. Until his trial in January 1999, Stephen was released on bail. However, a couple of months later, he was seen driving back and forth around the restaurant while Sandy was working. His bail was revoked, and he was returned to jail until the trial. The court found Stephen guilty of criminal property damage. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison and an additional year of probation. He was required to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, stay away from Sandy and the restaurant, and pay $3,000 in restitution. Stephen's conviction was a huge relief for Sandy. She never complained, but it was clear that she could breathe easier and no longer felt the need to constantly look over her shoulder. However, as the day of his release approached, she became anxious and tense once again. Stephen was released on July 29, 1999. After his release, Sandy's boyfriend, Tony Marson, with whom she had resumed dating, gave her a folding knife for self-defense. She slept with the knife under her pillow and always kept it with her. After a while, she wrote in her diary, "A car stopped near the cafe. The driver looked inside. I saw it was Stephen. The stalker had returned. He knew the distance he needed to keep from Sandy so that she couldn't do anything about it. He often stood across the street, watching her through the window. He was out there when she left work. He appeared out of nowhere, tormenting her with phone calls. He would call and breathe heavily into the receiver. Since, according to the caller ID, Steve was calling from a payphone, it was impossible to prove it was him, but no one else had any reason to do such a thing. Sandy felt like everything had started all over again. Her boyfriend Tony was getting fed up and was planning to confront Stephen. However, Sandy forbade him from intervening. She said, "If you touch him, I won't speak to you for the rest of my days." It should be noted that Sandy had many relatives and friends who were ready to stand up for her at any moment. She was the youngest of 15 children. She had 9 sisters and 5 brothers. Moreover, the employees of the restaurant and bar where she worked treated her like family, a close friend. All she had to do was hint at it, and they would have talked to Stephen immediately. But she firmly insisted that no one should intervene. Perhaps she was afraid that it would make things worse, like when she asked a police officer who frequented the restaurant to talk to Stephen. Or she was worried that the vengeful stalker would redirect his hatred towards someone close to her. It's unknown. In any case, she not only did not ask for help, but demanded that no one interfere. In December 1999, another alarming incident occurred. Sandy was about to start her morning shift at the restaurant when she opened the door to the establishment and smelled a strong odor of gas. If she had gone into the kitchen and turned on the stoves as required during opening hours, the restaurant would have exploded. The year 2000 arrived. On January 20th, in the middle of the day, the landlady of the house where Sandy lived noticed a package addressed to Sandy while picking up the mail. She read the sender's name and address. The package had come from Malden, from Lois, Sandy's older sister. The landlady took the mail and went back to her apartment, and just a few minutes later, she and her husband heard Sandy come down to the first floor, collect the package, and head back upstairs. Most likely, during his 6 months of imprisonment, Stephen had reached the limit of his rage. After his release, he was planning to take revenge. He had enough time to plan the attack. From a friend, he learned how to make a bomb, but assembling it was only half the job. He had to somehow get Sandy to open it. After the gas incident at the restaurant, she had become even more cautious than before. He needed to come up with something that wouldn't raise her suspicions. On his computer, Stephen installed a genealogy tree creation program to learn everything he could about Sandy. He discovered names, birth dates, workplaces, spouses, and children's names of all her relatives. In particular, he found the name of Lois's husband, who lived in Malden, a different town in Massachusetts. In fact, the family hadn't lived there for a long time, but their address hadn't been updated in the program. Stephen assembled the bomb from a pipe fitting, loaded it with gunpowder and shrapnel, and placed it in a box. It was designed to explode as soon as Sandy opened it. He wrote down the recipients' and senders' addresses, and on Thursday, January 20th, 2000, at 9:30 in the morning, he drove to Sandy's house. The man calmly approached, left the package on the doorstep of the apartment building, and likely stayed nearby. He could hardly resist the pleasure of seeing his victim take the package. Sandy would never have brought it into the house if the sender hadn't been her older sister, Lois. Sandy read the name on the package and probably didn't read any further. She allowed herself to relax, entered her apartment, and opened the box. The next thing Sandy's neighbors remember is that the house shook from the explosion and a terrible noise. They rushed upstairs. When they opened the girl's door, a foul odor hit them, and their eyes watered from the smoke. Sandy lay on the floor. They immediately contacted emergency services. The arriving police unmistakably recognized the smell of gunpowder. Cautiously, so as not to spoil the evidence, an officer opened the door. Blood and body parts covered the floor, walls, and even the ceiling of the apartment. Sandy lay at the end of the hallway, hoping that the girl might still be alive. The officer called her name, but she did not respond. Sandra Burfield was dead at the age of 32. Most likely, Stephen was the last person to see his victim alive. Her loved ones and friends tried to find solace in the fact that she probably didn't realize what had happened. When Sandy's boyfriend Tony was called to be informed of the news, his sister answered the phone. She screamed hysterically, her legs giving way beneath her. She could only utter, "He got to her." No one doubted for a second who the killer was. Just 40 minutes after the explosion, the police were on their way to the suspect's house. When they arrived, they were struck by the fact that there was a huge photograph of Sandy hanging in every room. The man was interrogated, and his alibi kept changing. At first, he said he was at the library in the morning, then that he went to a cafe. Later, he reversed his story, saying he was first at the cafe and then at the library. However, when the detectives obtained a search warrant, they found everything necessary to make an explosive device. According to experts, it was the perfect homemade bomb. It worked exactly as the bomber intended. In cases of pipe bombs, it's common for the energy not to explode in the desired direction, meaning the victim might survive and even fully recover. Unfortunately, Steve turned out to be quite the handyman. After the police searched the man's house, Stephen's sister found a booklet on explosives and handed it over to the police. After Stephen's arrest, he was placed in a cell with another detainee, Michael Dubas. Michael recognized Steve because he had seen his photo in the news. He tried to ingratiate himself with the man. After an hour and a half of conversation, Michael learned everything he wanted to know. Steve made many incriminating statements, including things Michael couldn't have known from any other source. He described the actions of the bomb he had made, confessed to vandalizing Sandy's car, and mentioned that she had a recording of him doing it. He even explained how he found Sandy's sister's address to deceive her. The motive? He was angry with the girl for not wanting to date him. He referred to her with insulting words, and any previous adoration had completely vanished. Of course, Michael relayed all the details of the conversation to the police. The court hearing began with horrific details of the murder. Not a muscle in Steve's face twitched as everyone listened to what the bomb had done to the girl's body. The prosecution had enough evidence against him. Even the fact that he provided an incorrect address for Lois on the package worked in favor of the prosecution, as this incorrect address was successfully linked to the man's computer data. Stephen had perfectly chosen whose name to send the package from. Sandy's older sister Lois was collecting small plush toys at that time. The last in the series was about to be released. Sandy also liked it a lot, and Lois had promised to give her such a toy. The family believes Sandy thought it was that toy in the box, which is why she boldly brought it into the house, expecting a pleasant surprise from her sister that would lift her spirits. In August 2003, the 44-year-old man was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, and the appeal was denied. Sandy's family could not allow such a nightmare to happen to anyone else. They were shocked that the law would have better protected Sandy if the victim and her stalker had been in a relationship. Sandy's brother managed to meet with former Senator Pamela Reeser. She helped change the law to correct this oversight. A separate legislative act was introduced focusing on protective orders. It now considers stalking a crime rather than a misdemeanor. The law was passed in 2010 and was named the Sandy Law. Now victims have the opportunity to obtain a protective order that involves criminal liability for the stalker, even if there was no relationship between the victim and the stalker. Sandy Burfield spent her life helping people, and this law, named in her honor, will now assist other victims of stalking.